Good afternoon. Thank you so much for joining us today for this Humphrey Summer Seminar. I see people are still logging on, but I also know from talking with the participants today that we have a jam-packed discussion, so I want to make sure that we get going and have time to cover all the topics. My name is Keith Hovis, and I am the Communications Director here at the Humphrey, and I'm so grateful to have the three panelists here today to talk about can the U.S. restore its global leadership? I will let them introduce themselves, but I just wanted to let you know that we do have live transcript available through Zoom. There should be a button at the bottom of your screen if you want to turn that transcript on. It's a box with the CC in it. If you have any issues, just let us know in the Q&A. Speaking of the Q&A, towards the end of the program, we will take some questions from the audience. So if there's anything that pops up in your mind as the discussion is happening, please just open up that Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen and type in your question and make sure that we can see, and we'll get to as many as we can. But without further ado, I want to toss it over to Isaac Russell, and I hope that before you take it away, I hope that next week you also come back and join us for our seminar series with Professor Maury Kleiner on COVID-19 impacts on the labor market. We announced our last three seminars going through to August 20th. Some really great things in there about human rights and the global displacement populations that Mary will also be back for joining us on. But without further ado, I will pass it over to Isaac to kick us off.
Thanks, Keith. It's my pleasure to be here. For those that don't know me, my name is Isaac Russell. Currently, I'm a third-year MPP student here at the Humphrey. Also, I work in the Minnesota State Senate for Senator Susan Kent. And my time at the Humphrey, I've basically done a lot of research on foreign policy. I have a significant interest in great power competition. Also, who are the people that form the national interest? How are those guided? And currently, as part of the paper that we go, some have to do if you choose to graduate. I am researching the Serbian position within the Balkans and how they operate between the EU, Russia, and the United States. So, not to take up much time to get to our discussion, I'm very happy to be here, and I'm going to pass it to Josh, to JR, someone who has done, who I've been in a lot of classes with, had a lot of great discussions with, and proof positive that if you want bipartisan work, go to the staff.
Hey, thanks, Isaac. As you said, my name is JR. I am a recent graduate of the Humphrey School. First, I just want to thank everyone for taking the time out to listen to the discussion. I think Professor Curtin has some really salient takes on the state of diplomacy and the international system as it stands today, and I'm pretty excited to be a part of the discussion. As far as a quick background on me, I spent most of my time at the Humphrey School looking at issues around foreign policy and national security. I was fortunate enough to have a remote internship with the Hudson Institute, where I looked primarily at US-China relations. And then I was one of two Humphrey students that were selected to go to Washington over the summer to intern at the Stimson Center. And at the Stimson Center, I worked on the Just Security 2020 team, where we looked at a lot of the issues that will come up today, mainly issues facing the international system, with particular focus on the United Nations. I'd like to introduce Professor Mary Curtin. Professor Mary Curtin is the Diplomat-in-Residence at the Humphrey School. She also teaches a number of courses on diplomacy and foreign policy, and she serves as the program coordinator for the Global Public Policy Concentration. Prior to her role at Humphrey, she earned her doctorate in history from Columbia, and she served in the US State Department for 25 years as a Foreign Service officer. I know from personal experience that Humphrey students are really blessed to have her both as a professor and as a resource for starting their careers post-Humphrey. Her hands-on experience in the world of diplomacy and foreign policy is an incredible asset to our MPP program, and we're lucky to have her. I'd like to hand it off to Professor Curtin to talk a little bit more about her career in the Foreign Service and give an overview of the discussion today.
Thank you, Isaac and JR, and thank you, Keith, also for the introduction, and welcome to our other attendees at this conversation today. At the beginning of the summer, when we talked about topics that we might like to talk about this summer, that are things that we look at the Humphrey School and that are of interest to not only our students, but the broader community. To me, the issue of the restoring US leadership in the world is a multifaceted and very complex question. And it was brought to mind in part because of the events that occurred here in Minneapolis that made us the sort of center point of the world and of the new movement to talk about the problems of racial inequities and social justice in our own country at a time when there was a lot of question in what is sometimes a separate and parallel universe of how the US operates in the multilateral sphere. But what's interesting to me, going all the way back to when I did my PhD on Hubert Humphrey and Cold War politics, is how much even back in the 1940s, the issue of social justice at home and as a component of how the United States could be a leader in the world was something that Humphrey talked about in his famous 1948 speech to the Democratic National Convention. And so I think the issues are both about how we as a society operate. And maybe like many of you, I came to this from listening into part of the funeral for John Lewis this morning. And so I was very much thinking about that while I was preparing for this. But then also specifically, what are the elements of our foreign policy? How are they carried out? What kind of a profession and a professional staff of diplomats, national security, career professionals, and members of Congress and the Senate who are also engaged in foreign policy. So how do we put all that together? How does the United States operate in the international sphere? How are we seen in the multilateral community? And how can we advance US national goals? Do we do that alone or do we do it with other countries? And so when we talk about restoring and we pose that question of restoring, it's a many layered question. An hour is a short time, and I look forward to sort of exploring that with JR and Isaac over the next hour.
Excellent. Thank you, Mary. Obviously, your expertise is something that we're going to draw on. So I think we'll just go ahead and get started here. And again, for people who are watching, if you have any questions, please put those down there in the Q&A. We're going to be sort of assembling questions, and we'll get to those at the end. But to sort of kick off this discussion, I guess if you're asking sort of how you can restore U.S. Global leadership, it implies that there's been a shift, or at least some sort of change within that global leadership, right? And so it's important to understand just exactly what that change, what that shift is, right? There's the sort of overt displays that you see when it comes to signals from the administration, when it comes to actions from the administration, or when it comes to actions or signals from members of Congress, things like that. And then there's the sort of background relationships that the United States has maintained that don't make the sort of regular news that still operates. So when we talk about this, sort of loss of leadership or diminution of global engagement or whatever, what exactly does it mean? Like, what historically has been our leadership, and how would you characterize that?
So maybe to start with historically, what has that leadership been? I think that you do have to go back to the 1940s, when the United States emerged from World War II very powerful, both economically and militarily and sort of geostrategically, when many of our allies had basically collapsed in all those ways. And so the United States emerged from World War II, but then also in the Truman administration made the decision to be a global leader, and in particular vis-a-vis the Soviet Union, which was also emerging as a leader of a bipolar world. And so the decision that the groundwork had been laid in under Roosevelt, of course, that the United States wanted to emerge from World War II with a multilateral system in place that it hoped would help prevent the kinds of wars that had plagued the 20th century at that time. And so it was strength, it was a decision or a will to exert that leadership and to lead through multilateral institutions, whether those are the UN, the World Health Organization, NATO, or some of the other organizations that are there. But the United States leadership, as I mentioned before, has always come also from what we often call soft power, which is how people look at the United States' strengths. And I think throughout all this period, other countries, people in other countries, do look at the United States as a very complex and dichotomous place, where on the one hand, we can have a John Lewis who is celebrated for his work on civil rights, and a problem and a George Floyd in which there is problems of racism and racial injustice. And so those have always been there. That is not new, that there's this sort of two-sided view. So when we talk about restoring, then that, as you said, leads to the question of what do I think has been lost? And so I think that is similarly in two ways. One is the way in which this administration has conducted foreign policy by denigrating and pulling out of a lot of multilateral instruments, ranging from climate change conventions, World Health Organizations, to numerous bilateral arms control agreements that we have with Russia that date back to the time of the Soviet Union. In addition, a loss of the strength of the institutions like the Foreign Service or the sort of professionalism of the national security staff across the board. So that when I talk about restoring, you know, those are the areas that I think where we have seen loss.
Josh, did you have something to
Sure.
that?
So I think it's useful, and I think this is particularly true a lot of times in academic settings where we don't really give credence to the counter arguments.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm interested if you could speak to your take on the other side of this debate. What are some of the criticisms of the way that the U.S. has traditionally interfaced with the international system, both from a domestic point of view and from a global perspective?
So, you know, one thing about having been trained in history is that I also have, you know, a knowledge and understanding that I think is really important that we often forget and we don't talk about, which is that from the very beginning, there were a lot of criticisms of the way that the United States assumed that leadership. And those criticisms came from, as they do now, from both sides of the spectrum. And so from the very beginning, there was a criticism of that sort of emergence of the United States as a global leader as being, on the one hand, either militaristic or neo-colonial, that the massive, say, Truman Doctrine approach vis-a-vis the Soviet Union was always criticized. And on the right, a criticism in the United States, particularly, that the United States had ceded sovereignty to these multilateral institutions. A more recent criticism of both US leadership and the sort of instruments of multilateralism, whether those are trade agreements or instruments like the World Bank or the International Monetary Fund, is that they have left many people behind. That the criticism is that for all the benefits they may have brought, which they have, that they also perhaps have accelerated disparities in income and wealth, and that you can see in this country and in many other countries a feeling among many people that they did not benefit from whether it's multilateral trade, globalism, or any of the other aspects of that sort of internationalist approach that the United States has led since the end of World War II.
So, I mean, I agree with you, and the way I kind of see this, you know, looking, for instance, I'll take a look at the left. You know, this does happen on both sides. Obviously, the right-wing variant of the nationalism gets a lot of play, but there is something that arises on the left. But
Yes.
interestingly, for the left, is that they don't necessarily see the end of the Cold War as the sort of magnus opus of capitalism and market economies, right? To them, they draw a longer line of history and say the United States is an empire, and it's been an empire going all the way back to individuals like Smedley Butler saying that they were a gangster for capitalism. So they don't really see that difference. For them, it's the material interests dominate the ideational value sort of statements, right? And that is captured in comments like profit over people, you know, capital over capital over the environment, things like that. So they point to these international institutions and say that there's a point in which the values conflict with the actual material interests of the United States, and the United States weighs in on the material interests over the values. So they'll point to things like TPP, and they'll say, well, labor was largely left out of the negotiations, and so this is just proof positive, and this would have very damaging effects for individuals within these countries, medical, drug prices, environment, workers' rights, things like that. They'll also point to the Iraq War. The Iraq War was not about bringing democracy to Iraq because you really didn't care, because look at the long line of interferences in democracies in other countries, you know, 53, 54, 73, you can, you know, go chapter and verse on this. For them, it was about access to oil. Or they'll take a look at Saudi Arabia. You support Saudi Arabia despite the fact that their portfolio on human rights is just absolutely horrendous. And they have funded terrorists. They're been one of the biggest terrorist funders that promote a Wahhabi doctrine. They're very critical of Israel and their occupation. You see that even with local National Representative Ilhan Omar and her comments on Israel and the occupation, the support for BDS. So that's what they say. They say that we want these institutions to begin to reflect the values that are actually stated versus the material interests.
Yeah,
so, go ahead.
Sorry, go ahead.
Can I just say something real quick? What I think is important, and what I think I try to do, is to embrace the fact that there is a lot of contradictory elements to the reality of how the US has led in the world, in the same way that there is a lot of contradiction within our own, within our own society, of the benefits of democracy and opportunity, and the realities that not everyone benefits from that. And what's so interesting about a long line of Minnesota politicians, including right here in the 5th Congressional District, is that, or whether you want to go back to Humphrey or even back earlier, is that we have often had leaders who have not been satisfied with the way that foreign policy has played out, and in particular with the way that issues like human rights are incorporated into foreign policy. And so in the 1970s, for example, Don Fraser, who was the representative from this district at that time, was the author, and not just the author, but a real proponent of incorporating considerations of human rights into foreign policy decision-making, especially with regard to assistance programs to countries where there had been a record of human rights violations. And that desire grew out of his belief that we weren't living up to those ideals that we talked about. And as a Foreign Service officer, I worked in a number of offices, and I served in a number of places where we had to look at the implementation of Don Fraser's amendment, including working on the Human Rights Report, which was part of that law. And so it is, I think, and I think that is how often the US is viewed from overseas, that we do, there are places where you can look at US policy, certainly vis-a-vis Saudi Arabia, and really question where is that promotion of human rights. And you can look at other places, for example, when I was in Mali, where a democratic revolution really looked to the United States as an inspiration and a model. And so that I think, there is a sort of reality that throughout all this time since World War II, you can pick one side or the other and either say, oh, the United States always has a tradition of supporting human rights and values, or the United States never does. And the reality actually is very complex, because the United States, like every country, has competing interests, and those policies are often hard fought, both within the policy establishment and then particularly between a variety of administrations and Congress. JR, I know you were going to say something also.
Yeah, so Isaac kind of gave a brief talk about the perspective from the left, and it's always intriguing to me. He and I have these conversations semi-regularly, how often there is that common ground on these disagreements and criticisms.
Yeah.
And you don't necessarily always see that as an overt thing out in the open, but it's true. When I think about this question, there's a specific example and then kind of a macro.
Mm-hmm.
The specific example was the US departing the Human Rights Council. So the discussion on that, as Isaac kind of discussed, was you have blatant human rights abusers on the Human Rights Council.
Yes.
And there is very legitimate criticism towards that body, toward Israel bias. You have an agenda item that's completely devoted to discussing Israel, agenda item 7, which no other territory has. That is a singled out instance in that case.
Yep.
The number of resolutions and condemnations against Israel outmatch any that the body puts out. And then on a macro level, you kind of touched on this, but I think conservative-minded people are inherently skeptical of any notion of ceding sovereignty. And there's been this idea, and we discussed this at the Stimson Center a lot with UN officials and government officials from around the world, the idea that a lot of the kind of foreign policy establishment folks across the world have this idea of a changing nature of sovereignty, or a changing definition of sovereignty. And that makes people inherently uncomfortable, because you're ceding out your authority and your representation, in this case, to a foreign institution. You know, you're ceding it offshore, essentially. So, and this manifests too a lot of times under the umbrella of human rights protection, which you're going to find, you know, I would argue you wouldn't find many people that don't think that that's a good, honorable endeavor to go for. But when you have things like the R2P that has language about non-consensual intervention in country, there's a lot of conservative-minded people that see that as a very threatening change of language. So I think that's worth exploring as well.
Yeah, and I think, and just for people in the audience who don't know, R2P refers to a doctrine called the responsibility to protect, which emerged in the wake of the genocides in Rwanda and Srebrenica in particular, which describes, it's not an international treaty, it describes the responsibility of nations to intervene, including militarily, to stop genocide or other kinds of things. So, so I agree also that there, you know, and I think you really summarized really well some of the perspective from the more conservative side of wariness and criticism of and fear of, you know, what it means for the United States to be part of multilateral organizations. And the idea of these organizations is precisely that you cede a certain amount of sovereignty in order to gain something. And so if it is a security organization, then you cede a certain amount of sovereignty in order to gain, say, military security. And so NATO, for example, is an alliance in which Article 5 states that any member state will come to the defense of another member state, and in case they are attacked. So there is a way in which, I mean, member states decide just not to do anything, but there is a way in which you're ceding sovereignty. You're saying that we have a commitment to respond to the needs of another country if they are attacked. And that is ceding sovereignty, but the idea is then that you gain something. That if you join a human rights convention under the United Nations, it's not, and I think that you described well, the perspective is that it is an outside foreign group that will tell us what to do, rather than an organization of which we are a member, in which we help set the standards that then we agree to follow. So we cede a certain amount of sovereignty in signing treaties. In return, we expect that other countries will also follow those guidelines, and that kind of cooperation and mutual agreement will make us all stronger. And I do think, though, that you have hit on, one of the problems with multilateral organizations is that if they're going to be universal, there are going to be countries in there who do not agree with our perspective on what it means to be a human rights council. The Human Rights Council possibly is one of the more troubled or even dichotomous elements of that whole UN system. The United States has struggled for decades with the focus on Israel at the Human Rights Council and its predecessor. And this isn't the first time that the United States has pulled out. And on the other hand, the United States supports the really important work that some of the rapporteurs of the Human Rights Council do in digging into problematic things in other countries, whether that's Burma's treatment of the Rohingya or violations by other governments. And so the United States has debated within the foreign policy establishment, within different administrations over time, whether or not it's better to be on the inside of that council, making it better. I know when the new council was reconstituted before the United States rejoined, I was in Poland at that time, and the Poles very much wanted the United States to come back in because they felt that without the US strength and leadership, that the council was going to veer even further from those commitments on human rights. But I think you have hit on a question that, so I mentioned before the issue of, the fact that a lot of people are left behind in a lot of these institutions, but that question of sovereignty is something that has arisen in many shapes, certainly was behind the Brexit movement in the UK, the sense that, the reality that joining the EU involves a dramatic and significant cession of sovereignty, not to a foreign body, but to a membership organization. And so the idea that the United States came out of World War II with was that the United States would be more secure and its interests would be better guarded if it were a member of, not just a member of, but a leader of these various multilateral organizations.
So just real quick, and we move on to the next question, but there's one thing that I think everyone is talking here, and there's a sort of disconnect between the actions and the values that are stated. But there's people who would say, push back about this, if you want to call it the liberal international world order, liberal hegemony, however you define it, is that sort of hypocrisy is what lubricates the system, actually allows for deals, compromises, things to be made. So that is an aspect that I noticed that was provided for pushback. But some of the things that you said, Mary, tie into our next question actually very well. You're talking about the extension of these sort of values, or the extension of rules, guidelines, means of reconciliation through membership into international clubs, right? And so, but what's very interesting is when that really became the national security doctrine, for instance, in the 1990s, in which we're going to basically say, okay, there's these areas that are experiencing ethnic conflict, minority rights violations. We're going to attempt to subsume the passions of ethnic differences, of this sort of pro-nationalism amongst ethnicities, even amongst states, with the idea that they're all individuals that attempt to maximize utility and in the classical liberal sense have these rights and values. So we extend framework for them to meet, to get into these international clubs, to access international private goods and access public goods. But the world 20 years ago, world in 30 years ago in the 1990s is different than it is now. The United States stood, you know, at the apex of world power, and there was no one there to challenge them, right? Again, it's the end of the Cold War. Russia is in shambles. China is still really beginning to try to open up and try to grow its economy. And there was no one to challenge us. The Americans are the only game in town if you didn't like it or not. Now it's different. Mm-hmm. Other organizations, other countries are not trying to be or trying to have the Americans be the only game in town. And so what are the sort of, those are the sort of structural changes I see. What are the sort of structural changes you see that provide those challenges to global leadership?
So, you know, one thing that I think is interesting that you've sort of touched on is that if we just focus on the changes and the withdrawal of the loss of US leadership that I would see in the current administration, it would ignore the fact that there were changes that were already underway and that demanded a lot of attention. And as you said, when the Soviet Union collapsed, there was a long period of time during which the United States really was sort of unrivaled as a global leader. And I think you hit also on a really important point that there was a theory that was at least applied in Europe that the expansion of the institutions of both the EU and NATO to countries that had previously been under Soviet domination, and then in addition to the countries that had been part of the former Yugoslavia, would inevitably bring them into a system that would then happily bring greater prosperity and security for all of Europe and thus for the United States. And we're starting to see some of that theory fray around the edges, even to the extent that it ever was as simple as it was described. Because starting very early on, obviously, Russia did not view that expansion of either the EU or NATO as a benign action that would simply bring, you know, economic prosperity and democracy to all these countries. It viewed it as the expansion of a US-based hegemonic system. So that, you know, it is the seeds of that, of what we see now as a very problematic Russia acting as it has to seize the Crimea and create conflict in Ukraine and other places, is, you know, bears a lot of thinking about how that theory of the potential success, you know, of the expansion of EU and NATO would occur. But the other thing that has obviously emerged dramatically on the world has been the shift of China's role in the world, that maybe, like the United States, began with China's growing economic strength. And, you know, as recently as 10 or 15 years ago, when you would look at China, you would see it operating in the world in a way that was designed to strengthen its domestic economy. And it was very cautious and careful, especially very resistant about being too engaged in multilateral institutions. And as it began to emerge from that, the United States actually encouraged China to join the WTO, to take more active role in peacekeeping. President Obama famously negotiated directly with the Chinese in 2015 to arrive at a bilateral climate agreement that would then pave the way for the Paris Climate Agreement. Because without the United States and China, that wasn't going to go forward. And so that we have seen that accelerated, I think, I would say in the last 5 years, with China being more aggressive in terms of playing a political as well as economic role in the world, and the United States struggling, I think, to figure out how to respond to that. Because on the one hand, suppose the United States does really vigorously re-engage with multilateral institutions, we now are dealing with the reality of a China that maybe on the one hand, we might like their engagement in climate discussions, but we may not be so happy about the way that they approach leveraging their economic power to expand their political power. And so it's not as though that's a genie that you can put back in the bottle. So when you talk about US leadership, I think there already were challenges out there, and there certainly were all these questions like we talked about before about you know, a lot of the economic disparities, the ripple effects of climate change, the fact that there is a tremendous amount of conflict in the world that has created refugee flows, and that maybe our multilateral institutions have not dealt with that well, and or are being overwhelmed by how those operate. And so, and then we haven't even touched on the huge change brought about by social media and, you know, digital communications. I mean, the fact that we're sitting here, you know, having a seminar and people are able to participate and listen in from many places is great. But we are also looking at the really negative role that social media and different social platforms can play, either by how they're used or by how they accelerate, you know, conspiracy theories or, you know, other problems in society.
So those are some interesting points. I do want to push a little more on the China topic in a second, but I think it's worth noting 3 of the main things that the Stimson Center was focusing on the work that I was on, at least, was the prevalence of non-state actors, cross-border shocks, and the third one totally jumped out of my head. But with respect to non-state actors, the idea that a lot of the existing apparatus is centered around state-to-state relations, and it's not necessarily in a position to address the rise of non-state actors as a serious both security threat and social movement within countries. The third one, I've got it now, I'll get it before I forget it again, was what you were talking about, and it's the rise of technology and how technology is outpacing the capabilities of a lot of these organizations. But with respect to China, which is something you and I have discussed at length while I was at Humphrey, my perception of the Obama administration's take on a lot of this was, even if some of these institutions and bodies of the UN have policies or procedures, what have you, that may not be as we would like them to be, it's better to be involved with them and change it from the inside than to be on the outside looking in. I don't think that that's the mentality now. I think that's fairly evident. I guess my question is, when you have a US that is actively retreating and abdicating these roles that we've previously held, at the same time that you have a China that is overtly trying to fill that gap, what kind of implications do you see both in the structure and maybe the ethos of these bodies, and just in terms of broader security, international security from the US perspective?
That's a great question. And before I get to China, what's very interesting is that it's not just China. Where the United States has left a vacuum, there are other countries and other blocks of countries that have also moved in and or moved forward. So for example, when the United States pulled out of the Trans-Pacific Trade Partnership, the TPP, the presumption was that that was going to fall apart, because the presumption was that our friends and, you know, friendly countries, allies, wouldn't go forward without our leadership, but they did. And one thing that they did, however, was to change the agreement so that they dropped some of the issues that the United States had pushed really hard to have included that would have been beneficial to the United States. And so again, if a new administration, for example, said, well, let's step back into the TPP, that has moved on. And other countries, including countries that we're very friendly with, don't always agree with us and make concessions to the United States because they want the United States in an agreement, for example. And so those countries have now, over a period of several years, moved on quite a bit in terms of just that one trade agreement. But with regard to China, I think throughout the Obama administration and even before that, like I said, there was this sort of struggle of, how do we make these institutions the best that they can be from the US point of view, recognizing that they are imperfect institutions. And pulling out of them means that we are not a voice in the room. And then because China had already made a decision in the years prior to this administration to be more engaged in those institutions, to join the WTO, to be part of the Paris Climate Agreement, to support with both troops and money peacekeeping missions, means that they are there and they are part of the conversation, and they will help shape not just how China participates, but how the organization itself begins to look. To the extent that the United States is absent, then that means that those organizations, which are going to have a big impact on how the world operates, whether it's the world climate system or the world trade system, that those organizations right now anyway are going to exist, and the United States is going to live in a world in which those decisions are being made. But if we're not there, the decisions will be made without US input. If and when the United States, and I think one of you said at the beginning, it's not that the United States has pulled out of every organization. The United States is still the largest single contributor to the UN budget, to the UN peacekeeping budget, to the UN High Commissioner for Refugees. We still have diplomats at senior levels who are playing strong and leadership roles in those organizations. So it's not like we have completely pulled back, but to the extent that we have weakened our leadership in any of these, or pulled out or threatened to pull out of the Paris Climate Accord or the World Health Organization, then others will move in. The world won't stand still and wait and wish for the United States to rejoin.
So I agree with what you're saying. I mean, there's sort of the famous Madeleine Albright statement that, the United States is, what was it, the essential or just necessary, right? Is that, we stand taller, we see further sort of mentality, that the United States is just absolutely needed. And you've seen theories that have arisen to support this hegemonic theory, hegemonic ordering theory, those sorts of things. But the way I've always sort of viewed China, when they opened up in 70, or attempted to begin to open up in 79 with Deng Xiaoping, they were pretty clear roughly about what their goals were, right? Even if it had some very competing and tough to parse out decisions that conflicted with each other. They wanted to increase the income of the country. They wanted to begin to discipline their state-owned enterprises and township and village enterprises to produce for market signals. They wanted to get foreign exchange, and then they wanted to transfer technology and managerial skill. And they wanted to use joint ventures to do that. And they wanted to contain those within their special economic zones along their coast. They had no intention of allowing a middle class to develop and to open up this sort of flourishing democracy. But in the 1990s, that's what we thought, because according to our theorists, that's how it happened here in the West. And so all we have to do is get that portion within China, and they'll agitate for increased rights, and China will join the world as a more liberal country.
Mm-hmm.
That's not what happened. China's basically made the deal where it's, hey, we'll increase your incomes, but the CCP is in charge, and we actually mean that.
Mm-hmm.
So you've seen them be able to use the state to help change your comparative advantage, and they want to take their seat at the international table within institutions, but importantly, not dictated through the American imperium, not told to them by American power. And I think we're kind of just now realizing, or at least there's been a sort of sea change into understanding that that's how China wants to operate. So when we do have these voids in leadership, China will step in there to provide that leadership. Now, do they have the resources? Do they have all those things to provide the sort of goods the US does? Not right now, but they're working on it. And you've seen their investments into Europe, their investments into the Balkans, their investments through their One Belt, One Road, their attempts to develop a blue water navy, their investments in Africa. All those are testaments to the fact that this is not China that locked itself away centuries ago. They want to be active, but they want their place at the table not told to them by the Americans. Josh, do you have something on that? Or
no, I mean, I think you're pointing out a lot of the big shifts in Chinese policy toward the world. You know, you have a China that's actively branching out, and that has myriad implications for us and the rest of the world. So I think you covered a lot of them. I do notice that we're running very short towards the end here.
Yeah.
So as we knew would happen, but so Mary, I guess the $1 million question here, and I hate to put this on, you know, a short leash, but how can the U.S. restore its global leadership position? Is it in the binary of entering into these organizations and reaffirming all of these commitments? Can this be done bilaterally? What are our options here from your perspective?
So I think that if we take all the different issues that we've talked about here today, and I'm going to go back to where I started, which is the the questions of things that are happening in our own society, because I think that that's really critical to U.S. leadership. I think that rather than saying, as I think some people out in the sort of discussion world suggest that we need to go back to where we were, and I think that would be a mistake. I think that the world, not only has the world moved on, but also there were issues, many of which we've talked about here today, that are both things in our own country and things that are realities about our own foreign policy and about how some of those multilateral institutions operate, that if the United States really wanted to reassert leadership, it could and should be a leader in saying that it will seek honestly to address some of the real disparities and difficulties within our own country, but also that it will lead in re-examining how some of these multilateral institutions operate, how we look at, for example, the relationship between the real climate emergency that is out there and its relationship, say, to refugee flows and conflict. That we will look at our own foreign policies that have become increasingly focused on military action and military assistance over economic and development assistance. That we will examine the inequities within, for example, the Foreign Service. There's a lot of discussion about a recent GAO report, which showed not just lack of progress, but actual backsliding in the number of, say, senior Foreign Service officers who are not white men. And how we rebuild, a professional Foreign Service isn't about going back to a system that was there, but rather, looking at what could be done better so that the people who represent the United States abroad really represent the United States. those are just a few ideas that I have. And I know we also have some questions there. I don't know if you want to maybe take some of those.
Yeah, so we did pull a couple of them from the chat here. So let's see. So here's one. Obviously, speaking domestically, it's a very polarized country on partisan lines right now. The question, the essence of the question is, can U.S. foreign policy move forward without the two political parties seeming to agree on foundational principles for the country?
So I think, first of all, there was a certain extent, we often talk about this sort of bipartisan foreign policy and throughout the Cold War. And I think that that doesn't really get to the complexity and the disagreements that always were there. In the 1950s, the leadership, until Eisenhower, the leadership of the Republican Party of Robert Taft was vehemently opposed to things like NATO and other multilateral instruments. There were opponents of the Vietnam War from the very beginning. There have been debates and discussions about what that foreign policy should be. And so I am not sure that seeking some full agreement on foundational principles is possible. I think there can be some general principles, but it is, and I think in a democracy should be something that should be robustly debated. What I do think is that Congress, for a variety of reasons that's probably subject for a different discussion, has not played recently the kind of strong role that it should if it is going to be a full participant in making decisions about foreign policy. And so, for example, military actions that Presidents Bush, Obama, and now Trump can take around the world are all based on a post 9/11 authorization of the use of military force. And that is not how it should be. And Congress has shied away from making any kind of forceful role for itself in that critical issue of the use of military force. So maybe rather than foundational agreement, I would actually put maybe more of it on that the Congress, the Senate, and the House should play a more robust role, not an obstructionist role, but a robust role.
I agree. There should be a robust role. And I think this question gets at a very fundamental thing that I discussed and that I've discussed with Josh, I've discussed with you, Mary, that what are the interests? And what are the guarantees that we're willing to make in today's sort of world, right? Who gets to formulate those things? It's very easy when you have a communist bloc to say that, well, we need to do whatever against them, so we'll do containment and we'll do rollback in some areas and we'll make these compromises. But how do you address the issues that we have now? So is it within, for instance, the United States interest, given my own research, to include Serbia into NATO? I say no. Is Serbia even a primary security concern for the United States? Right? That, to me, those are some important questions that need to be answered. You know, does the United States settle for good enough governments versus this measure of liberal governments as compared to the Western world's execution of that, right? The services provided for people. That debate hasn't happened, and I fear that there is this incoming cadre of individuals, if Joe Biden should so win, that have been steeped in national policy as understood within the last 20, 25 years. And that's the American exceptionalism that basically says, we have the answer for how things should be run, and you're going to meet those sorts of things. I think we need to look, my personal self, internally and externally. We need to reinvigorate our own democracy, but also externally is that we need a robust diplomatic corps. We need to also, and again, I'll hand it off to Josh, substantively ask ourselves, what are the guarantees we're willing to make? Because if, for instance, we say in the 94, I believe, Budapest Memorandum that we're going to provide some sort of security assurances to Ukraine for their territorial integrity in order to impart, get rid of the nuclear weapons on their land. And then Russia comes in and takes Crimea. That kind of just looks like we stepped up to the plate, called our shot, and then took strike three looking, right? So what are we willing to do?
So I'd actually like to get one question from the chat because we have about 4 minutes here on the timer. This is a question that I think is pretty important, and I think it's something that's been on a lot of people's mind as we head into November. So the base of the question is essentially, if a Biden administration, so if Biden wins in November and he chooses to forward a robust set of foreign policy priorities, to what extent do you think that the U.S. will be welcomed back into the system with open arms, so to speak, considering, you know, the isolationist bend and the willingness to pull out of agreements and deals and so on? Do you think that it is reparable at this point where we would be accepted back with the new administration?
So I'm going to address that, but maybe combine that with the other question about sort of the discrepancies between what we say and what we do internationally. And so I think the idea of being welcomed back was a little easier at the end of the Bush administration, or even as the Bush administration moved into its second term and began to engage a little more and a little more friendly face toward multilateral action. But I think in this case, the damage that I would argue has been done will be a little harder to repair. And so it is not as though I don't think either our friends or, and remember, in the multilateral system, we operate not just with friends, but with people who are not our friends. You know, the whole idea is that you operate within these institutions to create a more stable system. So I think that many things have moved on, and that can be good and bad. I don't think we just go back to where we were, and in my opinion, I don't think we would want to. I do think, to answer one of the other questions, that, you know, maybe some of the problems within our own society really have been laid bare by the events of the last couple of months. And that will be part of how both, I think, the United States should approach its role in the international system, but also how we will be received. And I think it's also important to bear in mind that and this is a leadership aspect too, that the protest movements across the United States also sparked protest movements in many countries, for example, in Belgium and in England, to look at their own problems that mirror in many ways ours. And so I think that a more creative new administration would look at not how do we go back to how things were, but how do we be part of a solution? And I think that it would have to be on different terms than it was in the past, because I don't think you do go back. I think that you go forward and you look for ways to be honest about some of the weaknesses that have been there and are there, whether that's within our foreign service, within our laws, within our, you know, our military actions, and go forward from there. So, and I think we are just about at 1 o'clock. Keith, I don't know whether you wanted to close this or just let us finish up the conversation here, but this has been great. We talked about this before, that we could probably talk for several hours this afternoon. And I thank Isaac and JR for being, you know, such inquisitive students, and for bringing such great conversation to members of our community.
Yes, thank you. Thank you all for being here today. And again, like I mentioned, we did put out the last 3 topics of the summer seminars. Next week is on labor impacts, COVID-19 impacts on the labor market. So check that out. I think that'll be very interesting. The other 2 are listed on our website, so feel free to go look at those. Thank you all very much. I thought this was a really great, stimulating discussion, so I appreciate your time.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mary. Thank you, Keith. Thank you, everyone that came here. Thank you, Josh. You know, love continuing our discussion. And yeah, honored to be asked.
Have a good day.
Bye.
Bye.